Hi, today we're going to be continuing our discussion of various World War I board games, war games, and we're still in the strategic style games that we're going to be talking about. We'll be in that for several more videos. Today's game is going to be Paths of Glory. This was one of the very first card-driven games ever produced. Speaking as a traditional board gamer, I had a certain amount of skepticism about how well this would work, but in point of fact, this game set a standard that resulted in several other excellent card-driven games, and that's become quite popular now in the board gaming world. This one was designed by Ted Racier. He's my favorite World War I game designer, and he has excellent depth of knowledge on the events of the war and how it played out, and his game systems work very well as simulated. This one was produced by GMT. This is the second printing of the deluxe edition, but they are in fact in the process of doing the P500 thing where they will get, once they get 500 pledges, they'll produce a third printing of this. Each printing incorporates any errata that previous games have had. Taking a look at the rule book, we'll go through this fairly quickly. It's pretty straightforward as far as the table of contents goes. And in fact, one of the features, of course, that I always like is that at the back they have Deluxe Edition Developers Notes, which gives you a feel for why some of the decisions were made in the rules. We have the typical introduction. You'll note the high collar values in the rules, which is always nice, makes it much easier to read. Interestingly, the units, the cardboard counters, have a couple of different sizes to them. So the large ones are armies, and the small ones are individual corps. Okay, each unit can suffer losses. So basically, the front is the full strength army, the back is the reduced strength army. Same thing for the corps. And again, you have an idea for how these things look, and they'll give you lots of different information on the counters. They're pretty well designed, and they're very, very visible, which is a big plus. The heart of the game, though, is the action cards, and they can be played in a couple of different ways. One, you can use them to produce replacement points. Two, you can use them to produce operations points. And three, you can use them to generate strategic movement values. Plus, it's an actual event. So, for example, this one is General Pleve for the Russians gets a +1 DRM because he was considered a good tactical commander. The maps in this game, which we'll look at in a little while, are area movement maps, not core or not hexagon movement. Again, flipping through here, you'll note that they provide notes. Different cards for different sides. The cards are fairly numerous. I think they're up to 120 now. And when this game first was published 20 years ago, I think it only had about 80 cards. But they've continually added new events. They've also broken things up. Typically, in a game, if you've got a lot of events that you want to more or less have flow historically, you break it up by year. What they've done is break it up by mobilization level. So the beginnings card deck is called the mobilization deck. The second card deck is the limited war deck, and the third card deck is the total war deck. And the additional decks get fed in so that eventually you have a huge stack of cards, though you will discard as you use some of them. And you can see they've got quite a few different markers and things available, tracking, for example, replacement points and so on. The rules basically talk about how you determine victory, the sequence of play. They move through this, action phase, how different things are done in the game. It's very, very quick, very easy. Strategy cards, like I said, are the heart of the play, and they have a fairly extensive set of rules here explaining how you can use them for the actual event, how you can use them for operations points, how you use them for replacements. And some of the cards are kind of interesting because they have reinforcements. So, for example, the Russians, you might pull a reinforcement card where they get a couple of armies and a couple of corps. Likewise, you might do the same thing for the Germans and even the Ottomans. So the cards can produce extra forces for you on the map. Of course, we have to address entrenchments, so they have a couple of different levels of entrenchment, but because it's not an area movement game, it's a point-to-point movement game. Because of that, you don't need nearly as many. There's only a few points that armies will exist in, and so you don't need nearly as many entrenchment counters. This will become important when we get into the operational games. They have information on restrictions on the Near East campaign, certain things you can't have huge numbers of forces down there because logistically they couldn't support it. We go into combat. You can do flanking operations. with this game because of the point-to-point system. And here you can see some examples of play. They kind of lay out, and you'll see how the points interact. The connections indicate where you can move from point to point. And because of that, some of them will be fortified points, and others, will just be areas, squares that indicate something important was there. Again, the explains how the cards are used to conduct attacks and movement, and goes into considerable detail there. Strategic redeployment is another thing that you can pull the cards for, just for that, and that enables you to move units strategically across the map in large distances. Forts, of course, are an important part of supply. They talk about that, but forts are, of course, an important part of the game system because it is World War I, after all. And a lot of forts, that was the last really important age of fortification, honestly. Everything else these days is pretty much field entrenchments and digging yourself in. War and peace. They obviously, during the war, certain nations began the war at war, and that would have been the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. But on the Triple Entente's case, for example, or the Triple Alliance's case, rather, the Italians didn't join, so it was only 2 countries there. And this discusses how you get different countries into the war, and specifically focusing on U.S. entry, Russian capitulation, which is a process that you can go through in this game. And it's driven by action cards that show up, event cards, and you come up with peace terms and all that other stuff that goes on with the war and peace kind of functions. Replacements, pretty typical rules there. They have extensive notes on the cards. This is pretty useful, actually. And it also gives you some idea, by the way, as you look at page after page of notes on the cards, that there are quite a few cards in this game. And then we get to design notes. So all told, you're looking at about 25 and a half pages of rules, some of which is taken up by artwork. And it's a nice large print, which is good for people my age. Makes it very useful. But there are a lot more pages to this book. So what comes next? Well, of course, they have extended examples of play, so you can get a feel for how the game goes. And that's very useful because this game is a little different from your typical World War I game with hexagons and regular movement and combat. So they explain how the cards interact. They explain how you take actions based on the cards drawn, and so on and so forth. It's an excellent example of play and very, very useful, especially for first-time players. The real secret of success in this game is how you play the cards. It's true for any card-driven game. You have a hand of cards, and you can play them in different orders. And because based on that, it's really a question of outsmarting your opponent, which kind of gives you a new vision of fog of war, if you will. Once we get past the extended example of play, we get into the various scenarios, units set up for different countries and so on. And that's how the game starts. We have they have an expansion set that was originally produced for the original game, and it talks about how to add those. And they occasionally publish extra cards in some of the various magazines that they produce. But the bottom line is this deluxe edition has all the known, all the expansion cards that I know about are already in this. And they also have an exception and special rules summary, which is very handy because, let's face it, specific countries had different policies, and you have to handle those basically with special rules. For example, the initial French desire to attack. One of the cards, by the way, that you can draw early on in the mobilization phase is you can decide that the French army isn't wearing red pants, that they went to straight blue uniforms, which lessens their visibility and reduces their casualties. So it's, again, pretty well set together, you know. They've got a nice index, too, which is really helpful when you're dealing with a kind of a new system for playing a game. I mean, most of us have a pretty good grasp of hexagonal movement and so on and so forth, but this, they provide an excellent index to it. And they also have deluxe edition developers notes to add to the actual game developers notes. quickly taking a look at the units, you can see here we have different entrenchment markers, destroyed fortifications, control markers, and we have different action phase markers and so on. These are different core size units for the various countries. The guys here, for example, are Romanian over here. These folks here are British, but because they're khaki, you'll also see things like the Portuguese, the Arabian Northern Army, and so on and so forth. Americans, some Italians. And interestingly enough, the Germans can form a Polish country to fight on their side. Again, it involves some play of cards and some luck, but they could theoretically raise some Polish corps to fight for them. So back printed, the counters are back printed, so the fortification level goes up. These are besieged markers. On the other side, they're destroyed markers, and again, control markers flip from Allied to German or Central Powers. And you see this for the step reductions for the various units there as well. This next batch, again, some more markers, but this is where the bulk of the armies are. So again, this is a strategic level game with a little bit of operational feel to it, but mostly strategic level game. So the large counters are the armies and the small counters are the corps. As you can see, you can wind up with quite a few corps, and you can break down armies into corps and reassemble armies out of corps. So that's possible. And then special event markers and control markers and so on and so forth. These, by the way, are strategic movement markers. So we even have a Russian capitulation marker because you have to put that on the turn record chart so that you know where you are. All right, that's pretty much it for the unit counters. Now we come to the play aids. We have basically Central Powers and Allied Powers war status track here. And you keep track of where they are, because each alliance can go into a different phase. So for everybody starts in the mobilization phase, but one side or the other may actually go through it faster and get into limited war earlier, which gives them an advantage because there are a lot of additional cards that show up at that point, and they can really start expanding their war effort. And then eventually you go into total war, and again, a whole bunch of new cards are added and new events. This is the reinforcements chart card, and you get a feel for different armies that can show up for each different nation. So the Central Powers in the north, it's primarily Germans and Austrians, but the Turks get some units as well. And then the Allied Powers, you'll see armies and corps show up for the Americans late in the war. But again, it gives you a feel for how the flow of reinforcements works. We have a terrain effects chart, but remember this is a point-to-point system, so the terrain's a little different from what you normally expect. However, the general categories are the same: clear, mountain, swamp, forest, desert, trench 1 and trench 2. Interestingly, they choose to treat trench 1 and 2 as terrain as opposed to some sort of special situation. We have army fire tables, corps fire tables. Remember, corps are smaller than armies, so obviously the results are less. We have an abbreviated sequence of play, very useful, and peace terms tables, so that when a country surrenders or exits the war in some way, you can determine the peace terms that apply. On the other side of this one, we have replacement costs, so you know how many replacement points it takes to rebuild something, and victory points, because you got to keep track of those as everything goes towards the end of the war. And we have 1914 special rules, again useful because keep in mind the war was actually characterized by two very different styles. The first 3 or 4 months were mobile warfare to a very large degree, and then after that it became static warfare as everybody entrenched. And we have the same card so that each player has a copy of this card. Makes it very easy for everybody. Okay. And here's the maps. I haven't pulled these out of anything yet. But let's go ahead and take them out of this plastic bag. Nice thing about it, of course, is deluxe edition. That's when GMT does a deluxe edition, they basically mount the maps. That's fundamentally what makes it deluxe. And they give you a nice solid box to hold it in and so on and so forth. But this will give you a feel for how big maps are and how many points you can move through and so on. We also have various useful charts and tables along the edge of the map. So, for example, we have here the Central Powers mandated offensives. and it'll tell you, you roll a die to determine who has to do it and where they have to do it in some cases. So, for example, Austria-Hungary can have a mandated offensive, but they can also have one specifically mandated for the Italian front. And then if you roll a 5 or 6, there's no requirement for a mandated offensive. The different cities are highlighted. Some of them will have different colored names. Those are usually either victory point cities or valuable in some other way, such as production. So, that keeps everything more or less tracking. The Russians in Central Powers, the Allied reserve box, you have reserve units, but you'll note the Russians have supply sources along here, and those are basically, if you will, connected to off-map areas and represent the resources available through the rest of the Russian Empire. There's also connections. Note these are dotted as opposed, or dashed as opposed to solid, which means they affect movement differently. But they enable you to move forces into the Near and Middle East. So, and down here we have the Near and Middle East movement areas. So again, you get a feel for what that campaign looked like. The surprising thing about point-to-point systems is that they can actually do a surprisingly good job of simulating, the more typical hexagonal movement and the kinds of maneuvers that occurred. That's one of the features of this game, like I said, is flank attack. So if I have an army here and you have an army here and here, you can both, based on the connections, you can both attack, and that puts you in a flanking position against my position there. Very interesting, very useful. And again, this is a hang on, sorry, I'm having trouble with splitting the map here. But again, it gives you a feel for how things shape up here, different fortifications. And in some cases, you can employ trenches with fortifications as well, so that makes a difference. Okay. So we really have two different map sets here for different... I honestly don't know why we have that second map set. I'll have to look that up. But again, here's the way the Central European landmass looks. This game is not as complete, if you will, as Death in the Trenches. There's no colonial tracks. I believe they're kept track of more or less through events, but the events are only useful insofar as they affect actions on this map. Basically, this is a pretty Eurocentric map with a little bit of diversion in the Near East. And so that's it for the maps. We have the cards. I bagged these separately because I went through them a little bit, but here's a Central Power event deck. So flip that one. Prince Max. So it's an event. It describes these are the operations points and the strategic relocation points. Down here is a row of numbers that indicate the replacement points if you play this card for replacement points, and this is the event if you play it for an event. So, and the various symbols actually mean things. I'm not going to go into that because this is already too long a video, but it gives you some idea of what you're looking at. So, and note that this is a total war card. Okay. So let's flip through here and find something that isn't. We have a limited war card here. And again, these are added to the mobilization deck when it occurs. And last but not least, we have the mobilization deck. And the very first card that the Germans, the Central Powers, have to deal with is Guns of August. Do they play it or not? If you play it, you get certain advantages on the Western Front. If you don't play it, you don't get those advantages, but you have a much freer ability to deploy to the east, for example. So this is a fairly important decision the Central Powers have to make immediately at the start of the game. The Allied cards deck is very similar. Their actions, their events are more slated to them, of course, and affect their ability to wage war. But the bottom line is that's the way the cards look. The game requires D6, so they provide a couple of D6 for you, and that's pretty much it for the details on Path of Glory. One of the things that we try to do in these videos is give you an opinion of how we feel the game shapes up, and surprisingly, again, I'm not a huge fan of card-driven games because I guess I'm just in a rut. I don't play them normally. But I have to tell you, this one is amazingly good. It really kind of changes my opinion on the card-driven games just by playing it. And the upshot is this one has a lot of different things that are happening based on the card play and on the unit positions and so on and so forth. It gives a new depth, if you will, to the war, as opposed to merely shoving armies around on the map. I actually now have to deal with things like politics and leadership decisions and certain other things that occur. Again, a strategic game, though, so it keeps us fairly high level on this map, and that's fine. It plays fast. You know, you don't have to spend 3.5 weeks setting up and then play for 6 months in order to reach a conclusion. So it's not a monster game, but there's a lot of variety. There's a tremendous amount of replay value because card play changes every time you play, and it's really a very good simulation of the First World War. Most people consider the First World War to be sort of a dull and boring topic. You know, I mean, like we talked about this earlier, it's basically two armies sitting in trenches shooting at each other with artillery, and that's not very exciting in game terms. But games like this one actually make it exciting. They add value, they add events, they kind of put you in a position where you have to deal with the unexpected even as you negotiate the difficulties of the actual combat. So all in all, I would say this is well worth picking up if you can get a copy of it. And if you can't get a copy of it now, or it's too expensive, they are in fact going to publish a third printing as soon as they get enough orders. And if you want it, go on GMT and sign up for the P500 and it'll get printed that much faster. And that pretty much concludes this. I would, once again, if you like this, please go ahead and like the video. And if you are interested in seeing more of these, please go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And on that note, have a great day.